Policy for 2020-2030, NYP 2030 is what it's called, is a cross-sectoral policy aimed at effecting positive youth development efforts from local, provincial and national levels in South Africa. Now, it is developed by young people, for all young people in the country, with the intention to redress the wrongs and the injustices of the past and deal decisively with new and emerging challenges, as well as the needs of the country's diverse youth. Now, to discuss this story further, I'm joined now by Tebogo Suping, who is the network manager at Activate Change Drivers. Welcome, Tebogo. Lovely to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, Tammy.
Now, let's look. We do actually have a national youth policy that's in place.
Right.
That one was covering us just for 5 years. So this one is a 10-year draft policy that has been put in place. When you juxtapose the two with each other, what would you say are the main differences between these two policies?
I think it's important to note that this is our third official youth policy as a country. And so one of the conversations with Activate Change Drivers, having been part of the process since 2015, was that 5 years is not enough. Number one, to diagnose issues. Number two, to implement. Three, to review. And then still at the same time to take in the draft issues. It's part of the consultations that are happening at the moment. Because significantly to see is that in the policy, not a lot has shifted. South Africa is still facing the same problems that it's had before. I mean, the issues of school children within a 12-year frame period who are going missing in the school education system is worrying. And part of the plans of the intervention of the youth policy is to say, how do we keep 90% of these young people into the schools? We have issues of unemployment. It has not gone down in the past 5 years, which means critical interventions still need to be done. So as much as a lot of strides have been taken to try and push things forward, the socio-economic factors that South Africa faces make it more and more difficult for implementation and for issues to be resolved.
And it's quite important what you mentioned earlier on, that you need a longer period than 5 years to actually do any sort of diagnostics.
Right.
So with the policy that currently exists, and you're saying that not much has shifted, so if the current policy is not been efficient in addressing the issues of school leavers leaving without a matric, of unemployment, lack of education. So what then is going to be different if it's going to be almost the same remedies for solutions that seem to have been inefficient in the past?
So having been privy to the process that happened between 2015 and now is that there has been an acknowledgement in the midterm review of the youth policy that took place in 2019 is that implementation was not prioritized. The resources, you might have the policies drafted on paper, but the resources and the support from government right up to civil societies are lacking. What is also missing in terms of the time frames is the fact that there's not been real political will within the different portfolios to execute youth work. An event for the longest of time has been considered to be youth development. That is not enough. And we can see that those things have not shifted. It's good and great to celebrate festivities and historical moments in our lives, but those things are not moving the needle forward. And what has come out of that process is the mainstreaming guideline from the National Youth Policy of 2015, which says, how do we now ensure that on paper we can ensure that the different portfolios can prioritize youth development? It's not just about having one young person in the room and saying there's representation of youth in decision-making platforms. That's not enough. And also the numbers in terms of what government has been able to do is insufficient. So for example, if you create 10,000 internships where young people are in the millions, you have not shifted the needle. And so those are part of the interventions and the things that need to get done. And government has acknowledged that that needs to take precedence.
So listening to the President's speech, his State of the Nation address, and the amount of funds that have been allocated, towards youth development, is that satisfactory for you? Do you believe that those are the type of resources that you need to be able to make a sizable change within the development of South Africa's youth?
It's made with good intent, but it's not sufficient. For example, South Africa is sitting with a rising crisis of young people who are considered the NEET, which is not in education, employment, and training. And what that means is the jobs that are being created are not even enough to absorb those young people. Never mind the other ones who are still studying in varsity, still hoping to get an opportunity to further their careers. And so at the heart of the National Youth Policy is a call really to business to parliamentarians, to policymakers, to people at ground level in civil society to say, we need to prioritize this, because if we don't, the country's running out of time with an anxious youth that's building a lot of resentment and anger. And there's only one direction that can go.
Chaotic.
Right.
Let's look at the various pillars. There are 5 main pillars of this draft. Now, the numbers, and talking about the numbers, say only 52% of South Africans aged 24 actually leave the educational system with a matric.
Sure.
And this is much lower than in other developing countries where the average is around 70%.
Right.
The issues of dropout and quality education, are those adequately addressed? And if so, what type of prescription is there for them within the draft policy?
I'll just make an example based on what the Gauteng province has already stated, is that South African young people are not reading and writing for understanding. And what is happening along the line is that those same young people are being pushed through the system. And we hope for a miracle when they get to grade 12. That is not sufficient. And so we've been calling and advocating for a drastic reform in the curriculum of this country. And also, how do we hope to change anything if the benchmark of a young person is 33.3%? Competing with the highest in the world, competing with the United States, for example, where 74% is required for you to pass the grade. We are not preparing young people for what is out there. We have not really equipped, for example, for this digital era that we find ourselves in. Merely handing over a young person a tablet without the skill and then sufficient knowledge to know what to do that comes out of that is not sufficient. So our curriculum in terms of education requires drastic reform.
Let's talk about this issue that you brought up a bit earlier, the fact that there aren't enough jobs to absorb the youth.
Absolutely.
If you look at the economic participation and transformation pillar of this particular policy, that's what it was called before. Now it's been renamed to economic participation, entrepreneurship and job creation.
Sure.
So clearly a focus and I guess an acknowledgement that entrepreneurship needs to be a key part of this dynamic in order to ensure that our youth are employed.
Right.
What are the suggestions that the draft puts forward?
Well, one of the concerted efforts that the draft is calling for is rural development. We are sitting with resources that are becoming white elephants. We are seeing a lot of migration of young people with the skills, with the knowledge, and where the resource and the factors of production are coming into the cities, coming to be an unemployed statistic. Part of that is saying that is not correct. We are not really capitalizing on the human capabilities that South Africa is having. And for example, what we're saying is state-owned entities are not producing the greatest results. We have skilled graduates and artisans. Why are they not coming into the mainstream to become part of the solutions of this country? And so part of it as well is to say, how do we relook what a job entails? There are a lot of young people who are at ground level, who are addressing key social issues, but they're referred to as a volunteer.
And we're going to leave it at that for today, Tebogo. But thank you so much for your time on this national draft youth policy, which is now out for public comment. So it is open for everybody, and I'm sure you'll be also putting your input there as to what you believe should be in there that is currently not. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.